Hello students, today we're going to learn section 2.3, two-step equations. Now I should have done two-step equations before I did multi-step equations. So again, two-step equations mean that it's going to take two steps to isolate the variable. So the word solve means isolate the variable on one side of the equal sign. And a reminder, inverse operations. If you have add, the inverse of adding is subtracting. The inverse of subtracting is adding. Multiplying and dividing are inverses of each other. So if we look at example 1, first identify the variable. The variable is x. X is on the right side of the equal sign. So I need to move this 1 on this side of the equal sign. So I'm going to subtract 1 on both sides. Because the inverse of adding is subtracting. Again, the inverse of adding is subtracting. So 1 minus 1 is 0. We have negative 9x. Negative 134 and negative 1. If the signs are the same, we add. So this is negative 135. Now to get x by itself, this is negative 9 times x. Again, this is negative 9 times x. So the inverse of multiplying is dividing. So I'm going to divide by 9, divide by 9. The 9's reduced to 1. So now we have x by itself. A negative divided by a negative is a positive. And 135 divided by 9 is 15. We are now finished. Please leave the variable on the right side because that's where we started the variable. The variable was on the right. Please keep it on the right. Okay, so again, we're finished because x is isolated. Next problem. Example 2. We have 7 plus 8k equals 95. Again, identify the variable. The variable is k. K is on the left side of the equal sign. So I need to isolate k and move all the other non-k's to this side of the equal sign. So this is a plus 7, so the inverse of adding 7. Inverse of adding is subtracting. So I subtract 7, subtract 7. 7 minus 7 is 0. We have 8k equals 88. Now this is 8 times k. So the inverse of multiplying, is dividing. Because when we do the inverse, it's either going to be 1 or 0. 8 divided by 8, that is now 1. K equals 11. We are finished because k is now isolated. K is by itself. So again, in these problems, it's taking two steps to isolate x. Again, it's taking two steps to solve. There's the one step, there's the second step. One step, second step. So that's why we call this two-step equations. All right, let's do example 3. So in this example, the variable here is p. P is on the left side. So now let's move this 4 here. So what is the inverse of subtracting? The inverse of subtracting is adding. So I'm going to add 4 to both sides of the equal sign. The reason why we have to do it to both sides is we have to balance the equation. So negative 4 plus 4 is 0. 1 plus 4 is 5. We have now p over 3. P is not by itself yet. This is p divided by 3. What's the inverse of dividing? It's multiplying. So I'm going to multiply by 3 on both sides of the equal sign to balance out the equation. This 3 and this 3 reduce to 1. So now you're left with p equals 5 times 3 is 15. Okay. Example 4. Again, identify the variable. The variable here is x. Now I have to move the 5 on this side. So if you don't see a sign next to the number, it's a positive. So the inverse of adding 5, we subtract 5. 5 minus 5, that's 0. 9 minus 5 is 4. Bring down the equal sign. If you notice, the equal sign is right underneath each other. Bring down the minus x over 2. Okay, x is not isolated yet. So we have to do the inverse operation of this operation. So the inverse of dividing is multiplying. I'm going to multiply by a negative 2 because there's a negative here also. So multiply by a negative 2, then I multiply this side by a negative 2. The negative 2 and the negative reduces to 1. So now x is now isolated. X is now isolated. Negative 2 times 4. Again, this is multiply. This is negative 8. A negative times a positive is a negative. All right. Example 5. This time there's parentheses. There's 2 ways to do the problem. Let me show you the way you're probably going to do this in multiple step equations. So I'm going to distribute the 2 and the 5. So this is 2w minus 10 equals 16. This is going to take more than 2 steps. So now I'm going to add 10 to both sides. Negative 10 plus 10 is 0. This is now 26. Now w is not by itself yet. The inverse of multiplying is dividing. We divide by 2, divide by 2. 2 divided by 2 is 1. So w equals 13. We are now done because w is isolated. Okay, last example. We're going to distribute negative 3. So whenever you have a number outside the parentheses, please distribute. This is negative 3 times h, negative 3h. A negative times a negative. That's a positive. 3 times 7, 21. Okay, so h is still not isolated. Since h is on the right side, I want to keep it on the right side. So I'm going to do the inverse of adding 21. The inverse of adding 21 is subtracting 21. 27 minus 21 is 6 equals negative 3h. The 21s add up to 0. The inverse of multiplying is dividing. So this is negative 3 times h. The inverse of dividing is, the inverse of multiplying is dividing. So I'm going to divide by negative 3. Divide by negative 3. Negative 3 is reduced to 1. So now h is isolated. 6 divided by negative 3. A positive divided by a negative. Negative 6 divided by 3 is 2. All right. So again, with solving, you have to make sure that the variable is isolated. And when we do that, we're using inverse operations to isolate the variable. All right, that's it. Have a good day.